Welcome, I'm Glen Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glen's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program. This month's interview on Glen's Parallax Perspectives will provide a lot of information about nuclear weapons that most Americans do not know. Even people who know a lot about nuclear weapons will learn new information in this interview here. We'll also learn about a savvy organization in Tennessee that's working hard to stop the newly escalating nuclear arms race. One expert guest will help us explore the topic. I'm happy to welcome Ralph Hutchison, the coordinator of the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance, OREPA, and their website is www.orepa.org. Welcome, Ralph. Good to have you here.
Glenn, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the great work you've been doing over the years educating people.
Good. And I know you've been at this for a long time at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and we'll find out a little bit about that during this hour here. But thanks for all that good work you've been doing. To help people understand the context for what we'll be discussing, let's go back a decade to, and I'll have maybe a couple of minutes here of just background explanation for the context so people will know the things that you'll be telling us about. A decade ago, President Obama and Russian President Putin negotiated a very good treaty to reduce nuclear weapons, and it's the New START Treaty. And the New START Treaty placed verifiable limits on all deployed intercontinental range nuclear weapons. The U.S. Constitution specifies that a treaty goes to the U.S. Senate and comes into effect only if the Senate ratifies it. At that time, the U.S. Senate was dominated by Republicans, and the Senate Republicans opposed the treaty. So in order to gain their support for ratifying New START, President Obama caved in to the Senate Republicans, and he agreed to a massive plan to, quote unquote, modernize all of the United States nuclear weapons. And the treaty was ratified then by the Senate. It went into effect in February 2011. Now, Obama's agreement to support, quote, modernization, unquote, that's really a euphemism. It's deceptive because it's not just modernizing them, it's replacing every nuclear weapon that we have with a brand new nuclear weapon, with all new nuclear warheads, all new missiles, all new submarines, all new nuclear weapons bombers. It's just horrendously dangerous because a lot of these weapons will be more provocative, more likely to start a nuclear war, and also horribly expensive. The cost was projected to be $1.2 trillion, but everybody knew it would reach a lot closer to $2 trillion. And so unlike the recent crisis that we had in late 2021 and early 2022, when the Senate refused to pay for the Build Back Better plan, none of the Republicans and almost none of the Democrats opposed this horribly expensive scheme to escalate a new nuclear arms race. So now the New START was written to last 5 years. and with the option of being renewed. And while Trump was president, he was allowing New START to expire. But even though it was going to expire, the whole bipartisan escalation of the nuclear arms race was going to continue with funding in place. When Biden took office, he promptly restarted or renewed the New START, but he also vigorously supported this reckless new nuclear arms race. So, Ralph, I laid out a little bit of context so the viewers will know what we'll be talking about here. And when we were preparing for this interview, you told me that the United States is going all out to provoke a nuclear arms race. And could you build on what I've said here and help people understand that provocative new nuclear arms race?
Sure, I'll take a run at that, and I think we'll unpack it some more in detail during the program. But I go back 30 years to the early 1990s when the Department of Energy realized that its Manhattan Project production capacity was running out of, literally was deteriorating to the point that things weren't functional anymore. And the Rocky Flats plant that had produced plutonium pits for nuclear weapons was shut down in 1988 by an FBI raid for environmental crimes.
Wow.
So they embarked on what turned out to be several attempts to revitalize the nuclear weapons program. Back in the early 1990s, they had something called Complex 21 for the 21st century. And they had hearings all around the country. They got so much opposition that Complex 21 sort of faded into the background. And then came Complex Transformation. This was 10 years later, another big run at let's try to redo the nuclear weapons complex. That flopped as well. And finally, they hit on what you described as modernization. And I used to put it in air quotes too. It's become such a part of their vocabulary now that, but it is really important to realize that the word is very deceptive, as you said.
Yeah.
But it sounds innocuous enough. You know, I mean, who can be against modernizing something? It doesn't sound like we're doing anything dramatically bad. We're just cleaning up a few things and spiffing it up and shining the decals on it. So when Barack Obama came to the Senate with the New START treaty, I think it was such a clearly needed treaty. I don't think the Republicans were dead set against it. I think their leadership decided to use it to get whatever they could out of it. And for them, that was the money for modernization. Not actually for them, but for their corporate sponsors. Right. So they said, we'll approve the New START if you give us modernization. And the couple of the people who were involved in that, one was Tennessee Senator Bob Corker, who's since retired. Another was Arizona Senator John Kyle. And they got what they wanted. They agreed to support the treaty. Kyle voted no after all. He was just totally dishonest about the whole thing. But we got modernization. The plans got bigger and bigger, and the projected budget went to $1 trillion, and now it's up close to $2 trillion. And in the last year of the Trump administration, the Department of Energy submitted a pretty reasonable for them budget to Congress. But the administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, and that's the piece that actually, the part of the Department of Energy that builds nuclear weapons, she went for a 25% increase in nuclear weapons funding. Unheard of. I mean, the rest of the budget is being cut all over the place. She went for this huge increase in funding for nuclear weapons. The Secretary of Energy said no. She went over his head to Trump himself, to the White House, and she got it. Mm-hmm. So this massive boost came in the last year of the Trump administration in nuclear weapons funding. When the Biden administration came in, rather than roll that back and make that a one-time anomaly, they're building from there. So the massive boost holds. It's not because it's not a philosophical thing. It's not an ideological thing. It's not even a military thing. It's purely an economic thing. So that was the trigger for the new global nuclear arms race. What did the Russians do in response? Modernization, right? I mean, they have to answer us. And China, which had been sitting pretty still, waiting for the United States and Russia to step down their nuclear stockpiles. I mean, China had about several hundred nuclear weapons forever.
And they've always had a no first use policy. China has never been a threat, but the politicians want to make it a threat.
A global arms race has drawn them in.
Yes.
You know, they're digging holes that appear to be for missile silos. They're doing their own modernization. Not long ago, I saw a graphic that said the United States is outspending China 4-1 on nuclear weapons. We're outspending Russia 5-1. So the one thing to know is that we started the new nuclear arms race. And the second thing to know is we are the driving force that's keeping it going. We're the fuel for the new nuclear arms race.
Right. And the United States has done that all the way along from the 1940s on. The United States, at each advance of the technology, the United States did the bold, reckless thing, and the Soviet Union had to catch up with us because they were afraid for their own national security. So then the United States would escalate further in some technological way, and the Soviet Union would catch up. And now we're doing that still, and China has been suckered into this because the United States is ramping up the rhetoric and the politics for treating China as not only an economic rival, but a political rival. So that would be a topic for a whole different TV program.
But I do think, I mean, all the way along, and one of the ways that this holds true is the nuclear weapons establishment has used language in a way that suits it, not as literal truth, but to convey a feeling or a meaning. So now we're in this arms race, and China's being elevated as a new bugaboo. And it reminds me of the so-called missile gap in the 1960s, which turned out to be there was a missile gap. But our country was saying, Russia's ahead of us. We have to invest in nuclear weapons and catch up. But it was the other way around. We were way ahead of Russia.
Yeah. It's all the entire history of this has been all about government deception, fear mongering, and corruption to enrich the weapons manufacturing corporations. And we'll probably touch on some of that as we proceed through the hour. In just a couple of minutes, I want to talk a little bit about your work at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which began in the 1940s. And first, I want to help people understand the work that is currently underway at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and at some other locations. Could you summarize what activities are underway at Oak Ridge and other places? And as you talk it through, I'll bring up a couple images on the screen. What's currently happening at Oak Ridge and other locations such as Savannah River, Georgia, Los Alamos, New Mexico, Lawrence Livermore Labs in California, and the Pantex plant in Texas. And if you could be kind of succinct, because we have a lot of content to move through.
So the nuclear weapons complex is not as big as it used to be. It's not as spread out as it used to be. We have 3 weapons labs that are responsible for designing nuclear weapons, refurbishments, modernizations, whatever, modifications, whatever you want to call them. We have 4 sites that produce components, and then we have 1 assembly facility. So the labs are in California and New Mexico. There's the Lawrence Livermore Lab in California, the Los Alamos Lab in New Mexico, and Sandia National Lab has facilities in New Mexico and in California. There are 4 sites that are responsible for manufacturing the pieces of the bomb, the components of the nuclear weapons. So Los Alamos has some very small, we call it bench scale capacity to produce plutonium pits. Those are the triggers. We'll talk about that, I think, in some detail in a little bit.
Yeah.
Oak Ridge, the Y-12 plant in Oak Ridge, which you can see on the screen now, manufactures the thermonuclear part of the bomb. It's called the secondary. They make that out of highly enriched uranium, lithium deuteride, beryllium, a bunch of other nasty materials. Savannah River has a role in that they extract tritium from spent fuel rods, and tritium is also an essential part of the bomb. And the Kansas City plant makes all of the electronics for the bomb, the fusing, the firing components. Really about, if you broke the bomb down into separate pieces, the Kansas City plant makes about 93% of the bomb in those electronics things.
Okay, so, I'm showing on the screen a very, very simplified image of what a hydrogen bomb looks like. Can you tell us what the primary is and what the secondary is, and your role at Oak Ridge?
So what people are seeing on the screen now is that is the physics package, is what they call it. It's the part of the bomb. It's not the missile, or any of the rest of it. It's the physics package. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you see a round sphere. That's the plutonium pit. It's also called the primary because it's the first part of the bomb that goes off. It's a little atomic bomb, a fission bomb, like the one that destroyed Nagasaki, Japan. And you sort of see those little yellow star kind of things around it, and those represent the high explosives that are used to compress the plutonium. And in the middle of it, there's a little space there for tritium. So the plutonium, the little atomic bomb, is activated by the high explosives. And that little atomic bomb, the primary, triggers the secondary. The secondary is the part that you see over here on the left-hand side. And it is made out of highly enriched uranium, the red stuff that you see there. The outer casing is depleted uranium, which is still radioactive. Even depleted is sort of a misleading term, but it means all the uranium-235 has been drawn out of it. That's all the red stuff in the middle. And it's now almost purely uranium-238. And then the stuff that you see in the middle is the gray area, is lithium deuteride, which when it is compressed in this explosion will become tritium. And that is the thermonuclear part of the bomb. So it's not a fission reaction, it's a fusion reaction, which is what is happening in the sun. The fusion of hydrogen atoms with the enormous power. So now we're not just a little bomb that could blow up a city like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. We're a massive thermonuclear bomb that could destroy all 5 boroughs of New York City in an instant.
Yeah, you just a moment ago you mentioned the tritium. That's one of the parts in the thing, and you mentioned when we were preparing for this interview, you mentioned there's a new project to produce tritium for nuclear weapons. In the 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal included a bold project to generate electricity by building hydroelectric dams in the Southeast through the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. Probably only a few persons probably watching this interview know that the TVA also produces nuclear power. And even fewer persons have probably heard about the government's plan to use those nuclear power plants in the TVA to generate a lot of tritium for building even more nuclear weapons. You mentioned this when we were preparing for the interview. I wonder if you could take just a brief moment and tell people about that project.
Sure, and TVA will come up again when we go and talk about the history of Oak Ridge.
So
most of the parts of that nuclear bomb that we looked at, the schematic you showed us, have a very long shelf life, decades and decades. One of the studies about plutonium pits said they would last at least 80 years, if not more. But the one component, tritium, an isotope of hydrogen that is necessary for all of this to work, has a half-life of a little bit over 12 years. And that means it periodically has to be replaced to keep the bomb in tip-top working order. We used to get that tritium from commercial suppliers, but in the 1990s, the United States decided that we needed our own source, the reliable source of tritium. And that decision was followed by another decision. We would make that tritium by inserting special fuel rods into a commercial power reactor, so that while that reactor is running, these rods, there are elements inside these special fuel rods that are producing tritium and capturing that tritium, most of it.
So what this does, Ralph, is I just want to help people understand this is yet one more linkage between nuclear power and nuclear weapons.
Sure.
The government wants us to pretend like these are totally separate things, but these have been united all the way along for decades. Back to the early 50s, when nuclear power was being promoted as a peaceful use of the atom. But there's always been several tight connections between nuclear power as a civilian justification that would lead to nuclear weapons. And what you're explaining now about the tritium is yet another corruption.
It's always been a possibility that commercial nuclear reactors could be used to manufacture nuclear weapons materials. but there has been a global norm against it, not a law, but an understanding that nobody would have dual use reactors,
Right.
reactors that created civilian nuclear power and military stuff.
Uh-huh.
And that's what makes this decision by the United States in the late 1990s such a huge decision, because it wasn't Iran that crossed the line. It wasn't anybody else. We are the ones who crossed that line that had been built between military and commercial nuclear reactors. We were the renegade state that broke the norm.
And the public doesn't know about this. This is yet another thing that the public has been totally kept ignorant of for very obvious reasons.
And here's where our public kept ignorant of it. When Egypt was developing a new kind of reactor back in those days, I remember reading an article in an Egyptian newspaper that said, lest anyone be concerned about this being a dual-use reactor, we note that the United States is using a reactor in Tennessee to produce tritium. So that's what we did. The Tennessee Valley Authority operates the Watts Bar nuclear reactor where this is happening, and our government used their doublespeak language again to try to give themselves a waiver. They said, well, the norm is about special nuclear materials, which is only plutonium and highly enriched uranium. Tritium is a nuclear material. It's radioactive. It's being used in a bomb. For every reason that plutonium and highly enriched uranium are special nuclear materials, so is tritium. But in order to give ourselves permission to do this, we changed the rules.
Yeah.
Now, currently, the Tennessee, the reason this came up in our conversation is because in January of 2022, there was a meeting held between Tennessee Valley Authority and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The Tennessee Valley, because the Department of Energy has said, we want to maximize the number of rods that are put in the reactor to make as much tritium as we possibly can make. Whereas up until now, there have been a couple of hundred tritium producing fuel rods in the reactor during a fuel cycle. They want to have 1,700 in every fuel cycle. This results in a dramatic increase in the amount of tritium for nuclear bombs. It's also very provocative for Russia and China. And it's just an indication that we are going all out, pedal to the metal. We are trying to amass the maximum amount of weapons grade materials that we can in order to continue this global arms race.
Yeah, the American government and the American culture and the American news media routinely fail to understand things from other nations' perspectives. We always see things from Make America Great, which is really a bipartisan agenda regarding nuclear weapons. But we need to understand how Russia would feel about this. What would we feel if we saw Russia just going all out to maximize enormous amounts of nuclear weapons production? Wouldn't we feel afraid for our national security? Why can't we empathize and see how it's like from another nation's perspective, or from the vast majority of the world's nations that don't have nuclear weapons, that feel like they're being held hostage by the 9 nations that do have them, and where the United States actually dominates this. We spend as much on nuclear weapons as the other 8 nuclear nations do combined. So anyway.
But I would just say, Glenn, just once, I'd like to hear somebody in the United States media, when they're talking about Iran, pause and say, of course, they're not doing anything we haven't done tens of thousands of times over.
Right. So I want to tell us a bit about Oak Ridge's work since the Manhattan Project of the 1940s. I'll bring up a map of the U.S. showing where Manhattan Project activities occurred. But during World War II, President Roosevelt started a secret program to produce an atomic bomb. And although it was called the Manhattan Project, there were secret locations in many parts of the United States, including Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford in the eastern part of Washington State. And I'll show some locations. Tell us just a bit about that work.
Sure. So Oak Ridge was actually the first site selected for the Manhattan Project of a permanent location. And literally within weeks of Enrico Fermi's experiment in Chicago to to prove that a nuclear reaction could happen and be contained, they broke ground in Oak Ridge. The reason Oak Ridge was selected was because it was a remote location. You know, it's pretty far from the shore. If Germany's submarines showed up off the Atlantic coast, they couldn't reach Oak Ridge. Also, plenty of water was available and plenty of electricity. So General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, talked to David Lilienthal, the head of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And the story is that Lilienthal said, "I can give you Fontana Dam." So literally the entire electrical output of this massive dam on the Tennessee-North Carolina line could be devoted to the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge. And the other piece that was available there was the willing workforce. Your viewers might not know that Tennessee's motto is, "We're the volunteer state." And of course, our football team is the Tennessee Vols. So they were relying on that when they located the Manhattan Project here. The mission of Oak Ridge was to create nuclear materials for a bomb, materials that had never been produced before. And the two primary materials were plutonium and enriched uranium. So they established 3 major industrial facilities in Oak Ridge on a 900 square mile reservation. 2 of them were for enriching uranium using different processes. And the third one was to produce plutonium in a nuclear reactor. If you just looked at it as a technical scientific accomplishment, it was stunning. It was stunning what they did in the course of 3 years. 75,000 people living in, literally, they called it a city of mud because it was completely under construction all the time. The first sustaining nuclear reactor in history was built in Oak Ridge. It was called the Graphite Pile. And here's a connection with you all in the Pacific Northwest. It was to serve as a model for the massive reactors that were eventually built at Hanford to produce plutonium.
Right, and we'll see that on the map here where it says Richland. Richland is one of 3 cities close to each other. Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco are referred to as the Tri-Cities. There are 3 cities right next to each other, but that's where Hanford nuclear weapons plant is, and there's one commercial power reactor there too. But when it says Hanford, or when it says Richland on the map, that's really talking about Hanford.
So as soon as the reactor, when the reactor in Oak Ridge was ready to come online, Enrico Fermi came down in person to oversee the last stages of building this reactor in Oak Ridge. And it turned out to be partly a model for the Hanford reactors and partly an anti-model, because the reactor in Oak Ridge was air-cooled with giant fans. And that turned out to be disastrous environmentally. So the reactors in Richland, Washington were water-cooled with water from the Columbia River.
Right. And the Hanford, there's an enormous amount of nuclear waste at Hanford. They have no idea what to do with it. They spend billions of dollars every year pretending to clean it up. The corporations that get those contracts keep screwing up and sometimes using fraudulent reporting.
Yeah.
The waste has been horribly contaminating the lands and the waters. This nuclear waste stays radioactive and deadly for thousands of years, and they stored some of it in trenches dug in the ground and some in steel drums that will rust out in 50 years. And it's right next to the Columbia River. So the Columbia River, which flows from there down along the border between Washington and Oregon and out into the Pacific Ocean, is radioactive. And people pretend to care about it, but only people really in the environmental and anti-nuclear movements are doing much. The government just pretends to.
Well, I'm sorry to say that's another sort of connection between Hanford and Oak Ridge. We have the same kind of environmental catastrophes waiting to happening on an ongoing basis, and because of the way waste was handled. So the last little bit I'll tell you about the Manhattan Project was, so in Oak Ridge, we had the Oak Ridge National Lab was one facility located in its own valley. They put these facilities in 3 separate valleys in case there was a catastrophic accident. It wouldn't ruin the whole effort in Oak Ridge. It would just take out one of their 3 possibilities. So
Plus people living nearby.
Yes,
Well,
very
yeah,
close by.
the people are expendable, but you got to protect the other nuclear weapons plants.
Um, so the Oak Ridge National Lab at that time was called X-10, and it was making plutonium in proving that plutonium could be made and extracted from a nuclear reactor. The Y-12 facility was enriching uranium through a process called calutrons, and the K-25 facility was trying to enrich uranium through a process called gaseous diffusion. And I could talk for a long time about the technicalities, but that's not so important. What's important to know is the Y-12 effort was faster. It made the uranium that was used for the little boy bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, Japan.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the K-25 effort, gaseous diffusion, when it came online finally, was much more efficient. So the United States, after the war, the United States enriched all its uranium through gaseous diffusion processes for decades. That left Y-12 needing to find a different job, because they weren't going to use that process to enrich uranium anymore. And it happened to be the same time that Edward Teller was out in California arguing for the United States to ramp up the arms race and build what he called the super, or the hydrogen bomb. Y-12 got that job. That's why we make the secondary, what I call the thermonuclear core of the bomb. The part that makes it a hydrogen bomb is that secondary that Y-12 makes. It's the only place in the country that can make it. It's made every single one for every nuclear weapon in the US stockpile ever. There isn't any other place that has the equipment or the capacity or the knowledge. So that's why it's a key role. It plays a key role in this global nuclear arms race and the quote unquote modernization.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's important information that probably just about zero people understand. And so it's important that you're sharing this information from that on-site reality there. I want to ask you about something related here. Almost all Americans pay practically zero attention to the official policies that are directing our nation's nuclear weapons activities. That sort of happens someplace else, and people say, "Oh, that's scientific. I don't understand it. I don't want to understand it." Or that's the politicians doing stuff. I don't want to pay attention to what they're doing. And the news media don't report on this because there's a bipartisan consensus in Congress, and no matter who's in the White House, that we got to have a lot of nuclear weapons. And since it's not a controversy, the news media don't have anything to report on. So the news media do not tell people what's going on, which is dangerous for democracy. Now, when a new president is inaugurated, the Pentagon develops a crucially important document that defines how the new president understands the role of nuclear weapons and under what circumstances the new president will be using them. And this document is called the Nuclear Posture Review. It's hugely important. Trump's nuclear posture review was extremely reckless and extremely dangerous. And the peace movement is concerned that Biden does not seem to be moving in a new direction that would be sensible and safe, even though he had campaigned saying he wanted to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. But he's been enthusiastically supporting Trump's reckless escalation of the nuclear arms race. Now, most Americans don't know that many nuclear power plants have reached the end of their useful life and should be shut down because they deteriorate with time. Things get brittle, things are more vulnerable to leaking and so forth, and that increases the danger of being allowed to continue operating for decades. The permission is being granted by the federal government to let these increasingly dangerous nuclear power plants continue operating beyond the safe lifespan. Likewise, nuclear weapons have also aged, and some years ago, the Pentagon proclaimed that it would implement life extension programs instead of developing new nuclear weapons, but they're developing new and building new nuclear weapons anyway. Can you help us understand life extension programs? Or, well, yeah, basically that, yeah.
Well, I think maybe initially the idea was that life extension programs would do that. They would make sure that the current weapons in the nuclear stockpile could be relied upon to function as designed, which is destroy all life on the planet. But But what happened was the nuclear weapons labs and the contractors, I mean, everybody just saw this as the goose that was going to lay the golden eggs for them. So what started out as a life extension program quickly became a program to modify the design of nuclear weapons so that they have new capacities, replacing parts one at a time or in large numbers. So they're essentially new bombs, but they don't give them a new number. So they don't say we're now building the B-94. They literally are now building the B-61 modification 12, right?
Okay.
So it's 12 bombs away from what it originally was as a B-61. And when they're doing, this is a particularly interesting modification because they've developed a new arming, fusing, and firing mechanism to turn the B-61, which is often called the granddaddy of the bombs. It was a huge gravity bomb, and now it's a smart bomb. Now they can control exactly where it detonates. The experts that look at this, Hans Christensen and people at the Natural Resources Defense Council, have done a study that shows that it increases the destructive capacity of this bomb at least 125%, and probably much, much more than that. All of this under the guise of life extension, we have a new bomb.
Right. Now, these B-61 bombs are being deployed to NATO countries in Europe, which the United States thinks, oh, this is great. We get more control over these European nations because we've got our weapons stored there, deployed there, ready to go. But it has angered and frightened a lot of people in Europe, and there's a growing amount of the European population that opposes the United States' use of their lands to start World War III from. And there's a huge political pushback. I know there are a huge number of local jurisdictions and national level parliamentarians that have called for NATO to get the hell out, take the weapons out, let's ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so public opinion has really shifted against nuclear weapons in Europe to a large extent.
Well, at one point, the German Bundestag voted decisively to have U.S. nuclear weapons removed from the Bushel Air Base where they're currently deployed.
Yeah.
But they were overruled by NATO and the Chancellor.
The NATO, which is dominated by the United States, gets to overrule a decision by a national government within NATO. So who's really in charge? It's not the German government himself that's in charge. NATO, the U.S. octopus here, is really doing things.
Well, and I'll also say, Glenn, just to modernize it, it's not a small part of why there are 100,000 Russian troops amassed on the border of Ukraine as we speak here in February of 2022.
Right. Yeah. People in this country don't know the context of that crisis. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the different parts of the Soviet Union became independent nations, the older George H.W. Bush promised that the United States would not advance NATO or U.S. militarism up to the Russian border. And when Bill Clinton became president, he disregarded that promise, and we expanded NATO. And so we are just crowding up against Russia with U.S. militarism. And through this multinational force that's dominated by the United States, how would we like it in this country if Russia had a multinational force, military force, that included Canada and Mexico, and they had Russian military stuff lined up all along the southern border of the United States and the northern border of the United States, aimed inward at us? Wouldn't we feel paranoid? We need to understand how Russia feels. And by the time people watch this program in March of 2022 on TV, we'll see if anybody's left alive to watch this.
I was going to say, if we're here.
Or if somebody has let things move in their natural course. Anyway, I want to mention have you talk a bit about some of the dangers of seismic problems. Out here on the West Coast, we are in an earthquake zone, and every now and then we get significant earthquakes, and we're still waiting for the big one that could really destroy a lot. but you have seismic problems there as well to some extent. And one of the things that I've read in your organization's newsletters is the danger of earthquakes at Oak Ridge, and the decision that, that the nuclear weapons production buildings really are not safe in case of earthquakes. The federal government is still dealing with highly enriched uranium and other dangerous materials in buildings that are in danger of falling down. Have I oversimplified it, or can you just tell us what's going on and your lawsuit?
Yeah, so when Oak Ridge was selected for the Manhattan Project, they got water and power and people and secrecy that they wanted, but they also got one thing that they didn't bargain for, and that was earthquakes. Because Oak Ridge is in the second highest seismic activity area in the country. It's called the
Wow.
East Tennessee Seismic Zone. Only you out on the West Coast, only California has more activity. Although I might say, eventually fracking might give us all a run for our money in terms
That's
of
right.
low-level activity.
Yeah.
But the buildings that are currently being used to manufacture thermonuclear secondaries out of highly enriched uranium are unsafe. They are Manhattan Project era buildings. They're now, they were designed in a hurry in the war to last for a few years. And here we are 75 years later, and they're still doing operations in these buildings. 15 years ago, the National Nuclear Security Administration declared they would replace all these buildings with a new bomb plant called the Uranium Processing Facility. And it was going to be a state-of-the-art, seismically qualified, big, shiny new bomb plant. They published an environmental impact statement, and they started designing this UPF. They spent about $500 million on the design phase when they made a discovery. The building they were designing was too small for all the equipment that was going to have to fit into it. So, and they couldn't increase the footprint without running into additional earthquake problems. So this fiasco became known as the space fit issue here in Oak Ridge. Our building doesn't have enough space to fit everything in it. Congress was so upset about this that they held no hearings, zero, and they increased the budget for the contractor to make up the difference.
Yeah.
And that budget was the other problem. It started out, this uranium processing facility was going to be built for $1.5 billion, and then it went to $3 billion, and then it went to $6 billion, all in the space of a few years. The numbers just seem to be going up exponentially.
But you had a U.S. Senator, Lamar Alexander, who kept pretending that it was on budget, still within the budget, and still within the time frame. It just totally lied about it, and
well,
he
poor
seemed to have
Lamar,
gotten away with it.
and he chaired the budget committee. I mean, he held the purse strings for all energy and water projects around the country. So if you had a dam or you wanted any federal money for an energy or water project, you couldn't cross Lamar. So this was his bomb plant, and it was going to get his money.
Yeah, even if he had to lie about it.
He kind of blew his stack when the numbers went to $6 billion, and he came to Oak Ridge and he drew a line in the sand, and he said, I'm fed up with projects that start out at $1 billion and end up costing $6 billion. And 2 weeks later, the Department of Defense released an estimate that said the UPF bomb plant would cost $19.2 billion. And Lamar was caught literally with his pants down. So at that point, he said, it'll be built for $6.5 billion, and it'll be built on time. Well, we're racing towards $6.5 billion if we haven't already passed it. And we're racing toward the schedule. It won't be on time. It won't be under that budget cap. But Lamar is retired.
That's right.
You know, he left the Senate. He doesn't have to worry about it. When the budget got so big, they decided they had to do some cutbacks to the project. And what they did to cut back the project was not reduce the number of nuclear warheads they would make. That number stayed at 80 secondaries per year. What they did was they said, we're going to do some of the work in these old buildings that are not environmentally safe. They're not seismically qualified, and we're going to use them for another 20 or 30 years. And they can't even be, they're so bad, they can't be retrofitted to be brought up to code. So when we pointed out that this was a violation of the National Environment Policy Act, they had to do another environmental impact statement. They blew us off. And in the meantime, the United States Geological Survey, that's responsible for all the earthquake studies in the United States, they update their hazard maps every 5 years, and they release new hazard maps. And lo and behold, the East Tennessee Seismic Zone's hazard went up higher than any other area in the country except California. So new information, with environmental impacts requires a new study. And the Department of Energy said, well, we're not going to do it. So we went to court. We raised the money online. A lot of wonderful people donated to help us raise $50,000 for a lawsuit.
I sent you hundreds. I don't remember how many hundreds. I think it was 400, maybe more.
It probably was, because people were very generous. And after 2 years in court, you know, the motions go back and forth, and we made our arguments. And after 2 years, we got our decision from the judge that we had filed this lawsuit in Washington, D.C. The government got it moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, because they thought it would be a friendlier venue. But the judge ruled for us. We won. The response of the Department of Energy was to ignore the judge. Within days of the opinion being released, they released a new study, was completely bogus, and we asked the judge for an enforcement order, and the court sat on it. A few months later, they produced the National Nuclear Security Administration produced a very weak supplement that barely scratched the surface of what the court had required. The court said, you have to do a new study and you have to look at the earthquake stuff. And we debated what should we do now. And then the judge died of cancer. And we realized one of the reasons we hadn't gotten this enforcement order is the court had been dealing with other literally life or death situations. But when we talked about the lawsuit with our lawyer, he said we could do it. It would cost more money. And we had a fair chance of winning. But then he pointed out, we won the last time. So winning wasn't necessarily going to be an answer. When the government wants to build bombs, they're going to build bombs.
Yeah.
So they're building a new bomb plant here in Oak Ridge. And 2 years later, they're moving forward with 2 new bomb plants to make plutonium pits, one at Los Alamos, one at Savannah River. And the citizens there have just sued the National Nuclear Security Administration for violating the National Environmental Policy Act, just like we did. And they're waiting to hear from the court about their case.
So this is a powerful example of who really runs this country. It is not the rule of law. It's not an honest judiciary that can have their decisions implemented. And it's somebody else that likes nuclear weapons and profits from them. And we really need, and the money. And so this is something the ordinary American people need to know about and get active on. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about people organizing, including your organization and the organizations we have out here in my part of the country and elsewhere. So thanks for that. We need to move on. We're a bit tight on time. I want to help us shift our thinking here of the people watching the program. I'll ask you a couple questions and see if you can give some kind of brief responses about the politics of this stuff. We want to inform the American people, you and I and all of us in the movement against nuclear weapons, keep trying to inform the American people. We also want to organize an effective movement to abolish nuclear weapons. What are we up against and who makes the decisions? And I sort of tipped my hand just a moment ago. Is there anything you can add briefly to this? And then I'll move on to the next question about this.
You know, there are only a few politicians with the courage and the commitment to challenge the nuclear weapons establishment, and there aren't enough of them to make a difference in Congress at this time because it's about the money. The president doesn't listen to the citizens. Congress doesn't listen to us because the primary driver is not security or military necessity. Congress listens to Lockheed, Bechtel, Honeywell, Boeing, and the president doesn't dare to challenge it. The University of California operates weapons labs, the largest pension fund in the country. Bank of America, BlackRock, Wells Fargo, all these financial institutions deeply invest. They're among the top 10 financial institutions investing in nuclear weapons stuff. So if we need actions from Congress to get rid of nuclear weapons, we only have 2 options. We either find more money than the corporations have, which is not likely, or we build the grassroots movement that compels them to listen. You know, I think you have the Eisenhower quote there somewhere.
Yes, I'll bring that up in just a moment here. I want to make another point, and then I'll bring up that Eisenhower quotation. I give a unique title for each TV program that I produce. For this month's TV program, the title is Well, actually, you came up with this title, and I agreed that I liked it. The new nuclear arms race is happening in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. But I also think it's also true, and in a more profound way, that the new nuclear arms race started in Washington, D.C., not just in Oak Ridge. And the new nuclear arms race actually also started with the weapons manufacturers donating big money to the politicians' elections campaign. I come from Washington State, where for decades we had Henry Jackson as a very, very powerful U.S. senator. He was widely known as the senator from Boeing. He would do anything that Boeing wanted. And now we have two other Democratic senators who also just routinely cave into militarism and don't stand up for peace at all. So, Ralph, to what extent do you agree or disagree with this assessment about the politicians, the money? I think you've already said some of this. Is there anything else you can add to this briefly? And then I'll bring up this Eisenhower quote that you mentioned.
Well, your statement about Scoop Jackson reminded me. Pete Domenici was the powerful senator in New Mexico and headed the committee for a long, long time. And he was quoted as saying, as long as I can bring the money home for Los Alamos, I can do whatever the hell I want.
Yeah.
Because literally 2/3 the federal dollars that went to New Mexico went into the nuclear weapons work at Los Alamos and Sandia.
Yeah, that's the kind of political culture we have. And I believe that only a grassroots movement can change that. I'm showing on the screen this quotation from Eisenhower, who even though he was a general and the very top general who fought against the Nazis in Europe in World War II and later became U.S. president, but he was actually peace oriented. He's the guy that in his closing speech as he was leaving office in January of 1961, warned people about the power of the military industrial complex. And I don't recall when it was that he said this, but you had mentioned this quotation when we were preparing for the interview here. But he says, I think people want peace so much that one of these days government better get out of the way and let them have it. So well, that's why we need to build a big grassroots movement. And I do a lot of work organizing locally here in the Olympia area. In 2017, I founded the Olympia Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. I'm currently the chairperson of that. I'm a very active volunteer in our statewide coalition, Washington Against Nuclear Weapons. We have about 60 member organizations around the state that belong to that. But we need to shift the political culture in Washington, D.C., but they won't do that voluntarily. We can change things only from the bottom up, just like it was the civil rights movement that got civil rights legislation passed in Congress. This was not a gift from Congress or any president. This was civil rights movement made them do this, and then they could flip and see which way the politics were going, and they had to go along with the public. So the system is so dysfunctional and corrupt that they will not change unless we at the grassroots organize and make them happen. And so it's a strategically savvy, nonviolent movement that has to grow from the bottom up to change the political culture and really the culture of the American people, and to change the news media, because right now they just say whatever the government wants them to say, and they don't listen to us. Do you see any potential, Ralph, for abolishing nuclear weapons? And if so, what strategies might help?
Well, I'll say two things kind of quickly about that. One is, I believe right now the best tool we have to advance the agenda for nuclear abolition is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We call the Ban Treaty, and you've talked about it a lot on your show, I know.
Yeah.
But it's the most powerful tool we've had in the last 30 years. It doesn't have any legal power in the United States because we haven't signed or ratified it, right? But it has moral power, and the moral power of this treaty doesn't recognize boundaries or lines drawn on the map or anything else. So I think I'm committing time and energy to try to build a grassroots movement around the Ban Treaty through collaboration with people. I think the other thing I would say is it's tempting for me, having been doing this work for 30 years, to tell you all kinds of facts and figures and numbers and technical stuff and fill up your head. And really, if you were trying to persuade me of something, that'd be a good way to get Ralph to agree with you, is to give him a good intellectual argument. 40 years ago, when I gave up eating meat, it's because I read a book that said people are starving and it takes 7 pounds of wheat to make 1 pound of beef. And I did the math, and my brain said, well, if that's true and we want to feed everybody, we can't be eating a lot of beef, right? But most people aren't motivated by their head, at least not at first. Most people are motivated by their heart, for better or worse. You know, when a politician stands up, we live in this climate today where politicians stand up and they say things that are blatantly untrue. You can watch the real thing on the video. When they're called on it, they don't apologize it because they're not using their words in any literal way to convey a rational truth. They're using their words to generate feelings, anger, suspicion, fear. They know to go for the heart. I think we need to talk to people's hearts. We need to be honest. We need to be authentic. We need to talk to people about what they really care about. Almost everyone, and the polls have shown this, Democrats, Republicans, rich, poor, it doesn't matter. Almost everyone cares about their children and wants a better world for their kids and wishes there were not nuclear weapons in the world.
We need to design our organizing strategies, our outreaching, the kind of images and messages that we put out with words or images or whatever, and the ways to appeal to people at the heart level and the gut level, so that people will become committed to peace, and then they'll be open to hearing the information. So I think that's just crucial. We don't do enough of that. We also need to use wit. And nuclear weapons are not a very funny issue, but some of the effective methods of raising the issue have used wit. The film Dr. Strangelove was great. And there have been some other things, and we've done some things locally, and other places around the country. People have done things that will use some wit, because wit can catch people off guard. When you're laughing, you don't have your fear ramped up, and so you can see another reality. So we need to do more of that stuff. I want to take a bit of time, Ralph, and we are kind of short on the time here, but I want to help people understand, the people watching this interview, understand the organization for which you've been working for a long time, the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance, OREPA. Website is www.orepa.org. 20 years ago, I met an organizer from your organization. She came to Olympia for a peace conference, and I was there. And I was so much impressed with what she said that I signed up 20 years ago to get your mailings, and I started donating money. So I've given you a lot of money in the last 20 years. And I've always been impressed that your organization knows the right stuff, and you're doing smart things, and you're so much worthy of support that I thought, I got to have you on as a guest at my program. Your previous organizer is not with the organization now, but you are, and I really appreciate all the reliable information and perspectives and activities that you've been doing. Can you tell us just a bit more about OREPA and as an organization and what you do and so forth?
So we started out as a grassroots organization committed to nonviolence, and OREPA started with the idea that they would do one demonstration in Oak Ridge back in 1988, the first time ever to have civil disobedience there. And out of that, here we are all these many years later as a thriving grassroots organization now. We have always believed in using every tool in the toolbox. So we speak at the public hearings, we do, we write letters, we go to Washington, D.C. every year, we do all of that stuff. But we've also been in the streets, marches and demonstrations and vigils, and sometimes civil disobedience when it was called for. And then we always said litigation was the last resort, but as we just talked about, 4 years ago, we hit that wall and we sued them. Mm-hmm. Most of our programmatic work is about the nuclear weapons in Oak Ridge. Locally, we also we have a part of our work that's about creating a culture of nonviolence. So we try to do a lot of work with our African American allies in Knoxville and in other places, doing nonviolence trainings and workshops and stuff like that. So
yeah, you do collaborate with other organizations, and that's important for a lot of the organizations I work with. Recognize that in order to reach our goals, we need to bring more people into our movement, and we also need to support other movements so that those people can meet their goals, because altogether we're a lot bigger than we are just separate.
Well, we
So
wouldn't be here without
collaboration.
Yeah, we wouldn't be here without collaboration. In our earliest years, the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability drew us in, and we met our colleagues at Los Alamos and Livermore and Rocky Flats and Hanford and Nevada Test Site all around the country. And that really gave us the perspective and the feeling that we could do it. I mean, we weren't just operating on our lonely little cells in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We had colleagues all over the country in the same. And since then, I mean, I've been really fortunate. I've been able to go to Germany a couple of times for the international peace camps at the air base there. We have, collaborating with global networks now, and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And I really think that collaboration not only helps us build a political strength, but it also energizes us.
Right.
To be able to work together with people.
Right. Thanks. That our nation needs to do with. So we really can abolish nuclear weapons. Thank you, Ralph. And thanks to all the people who've been viewing. Take care.